I was sitting at the kitchen table, coffee in hand, when my phone chimed with an email notification. The sender was Victoria, my daughter, the young woman I had raised alone after losing her father 12 years ago. I opened it, expecting the usual wedding update floor plans, floral choices, the occasional excited anecdote, but what I saw made the coffee burn its way down my throat. Dad, John Baptiste's family has made it clear they don't want you at the wedding since you don't speak French. Your presence will embarrass me in front of them. You can watch via the live stream instead. I read the lines over and over, each repetition pressing the same cold weight into my chest. I had worked tirelessly, late nights and long weekends, building a life that could support both of us. I had funded her education, her study abroad programs, her French lessons, her first apartment, and now nearly 2/3 of the wedding she had always dreamed of. $110,000 of the $180,000 total had already been paid. And yet here I was, being told I wasn't sophisticated enough, that I wasn't French enough to attend the one day that was supposed to celebrate her life and our bond. Shock gave way to a bitter awareness. This wasn't just about language or etiquette, it was about value. I was welcome as a bank account, but not as her mother. The realization stung worse than any financial setback could. 12 years of sacrifice, of shaping her future, reduced to a screen and a camera. My presence unwanted, my love apparently conditional. I set the phone down slowly, letting the silence of my Chicago apartment press in around me. The hum of the city outside the window felt distant, irrelevant. As I sat there thinking through the decision that was beginning to crystallize, there was only one way forward, and it would not be easy. Next, I would need to confront the reality of what Victoria's email truly demanded, and the consequences she had set in motion. I poured a fresh cup of coffee and watched the steam curl upward, but the warmth did little to thaw the cold knot settling in my chest. 12 years had passed since I'd lost Michael, and every day since had been a balance of grief and determination. I had raised Victoria with every ounce of strength I had, funding her education, guiding her ambitions, and working tirelessly to give her the opportunities I never had. And now, with a single email, she had reduced all of that to nothing more than a financial transaction. Sarah appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 mugs. She didn't comment on the tension thick in the air, simply handed me one of the mugs and offered a quiet, understanding smile. Her presence was steadying, a reminder that not everyone had taken my sacrifices for granted. I let my thoughts drift over those years, the late nights grading papers while running my consulting firm, the weekends spent walking her to French lessons, the long drives to summer programs. I had given her everything, and yet she had decided my presence wasn't welcome. I sipped the coffee slowly, feeling the weight of the betrayal alongside the clarity it brought. Something had to change, and I knew that facing this morning meant confronting not just Victoria, but the lesson she was about to learn. It struck me then with a sharp, bitter clarity. Victoria's career was built on connecting people across cultures, translating languages, and bridging divides. Every day, she helped others communicate, bringing families and businesses together despite their differences. And yet she had chosen to sever the one bridge that had always mattered, the one between her and me. I thought of all the sacrifices I had made to give her that very fluency. Tuition for private schools, summer programs abroad, language camps in France and Quebec. Every dollar I spent, every late night I worked 2 or 3 jobs at once, had been aimed at giving her the tools to succeed in a world I had never fully known myself. I had imagined the day she would walk confidently into any room, navigate any challenge, and flourish with the skills I had fought to provide. I had never imagined those same skills would be used to exclude me. The hurt was sharp, but beneath it, a quiet determination began to form. I could feel it solidifying with every memory, the times I had sacrificed vacations, sleep, and even my own ambitions so she could have opportunities I'd been denied. I realized that love without boundaries had produced this moment. The anger simmered, not as revenge, but as resolve. I understood now that if I did nothing, I would be complicit in allowing her entitlement to override decency. I would continue funding a dream she built at my expense while remaining invisible, unacknowledged, and unwanted. That could not happen. I set my coffee down and turned toward my desk, where the wedding spreadsheets lay. It was time to decide how I would respond, how I would ensure that respect and accountability had their place in this story. I sat at my desk, staring at the spreadsheets I had meticulously kept for months. The numbers stared back at me: $35,000 for the venue, $25,000 for catering, $12,000 for photography, $8,000 for flowers, $80,000 already gone, $70,000 more scheduled to transfer next week. That money had been intended to celebrate my daughter, to honor her happiness. But now, each dollar felt like an instrument of her entitlement, a tool she had no right to wield against me. I opened my laptop and began researching options: letters of credit, payment guarantees, revocations, all the legal and financial mechanisms I had relied on in my business for years. It was remarkable how similar personal boundaries and business procedures could be: a clear set of rules, a defined consequence, and the ability to enforce them without ambiguity. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I weighed the morality of taking action. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about humiliating Victoria. It was about teaching a lesson she had ignored for far too long. I thought about the years of sacrifices that had built the foundation for this moment: late nights balancing budgets, trips I had skipped to fund her lessons abroad, every small act of guidance and support I had poured into her. Could all that be reduced to a single email, a dismissive phrase, a denial of my presence at an event I had helped fund? The internal conflict churned within me, but with it came clarity. Love without respect was not love at all. It was enabling. If I allowed this exclusion to stand, I would be teaching her that she could take without giving, command without considering, and expect loyalty without acknowledging it. That could not happen. I closed the laptop for a moment and let my gaze settle on the Chicago skyline outside my window. The decision was made. I would act, but with precision, ensuring that my lesson was clear, proportionate, and unavoidable. The moment to reclaim agency had arrived, and with it, the responsibility to enforce boundaries that could no longer be ignored. Tomorrow, I would begin the process that would ensure Victoria understood the weight of her choices. The next morning, I arrived at the private banking office in downtown Chicago with a calm purpose that belied the tension knotting my chest. The marble floors gleamed under the recessed lighting, and the scent of polished wood and coffee filled the air. I approached Charles Morrison, my longtime financial advisor, who greeted me with a familiar warmth and raised eyebrows when he saw the seriousness etched on my face. "Eleanor, what brings you in today?" he asked. "I need to revoke the letter of credit for my daughter's wedding vendors," I said firmly. His eyes widened slightly, but he didn't question me further. We had worked together for over 15 years, and he knew my decisions were deliberate, even when unconventional. He led me to a quiet office and gestured for me to sit. I explained that the remaining $70,000 payment was no longer authorized. I was the guarantor, not the contracting party, and my intention was to protect my own boundaries while ensuring that Victoria and her fiancé assumed responsibility for their own commitments. Charles nodded thoughtfully, asking the necessary clarifying questions while I answered succinctly, confident in both the legality and necessity of my actions. The process was methodical. Signatures, authorizations, confirmations, the same precision I applied in my business now applied to this deeply personal matter. Each form I signed felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been given too freely. There was no hesitation, no doubt. This was not about anger or retribution. It was about teaching a lesson that words alone could not convey. When the final form was submitted, Charles printed the confirmation. All vendors will be automatically notified that the payment guarantee has been withdrawn, he said. I nodded, a quiet satisfaction settling over me. The decision was immediate, irreversible, and entirely within the rules of procedure. Victoria would have no warning, no chance to adjust. She would face the consequences of choices she had taken for granted. I left the office with a strange sense of calm, as if a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying had lifted. The streets of Chicago were alive with morning traffic, yet the world felt still in my mind, focused entirely on the decision I had executed. For the first time since reading her email, I felt control, not anger, not resentment, control. The letter of credit had been revoked. The foundation of Victoria's carefully planned wedding was quietly removed, and the responsibility now rested fully on her. The anticipation of what would unfold in the coming days was mine alone to carry, and I allowed myself a small, resolute smile as I walked back to my apartment. By the time I arrived home, I was ready to settle into the waiting, knowing that tomorrow would bring the first signs of consequence. And with it, the clarity of the lesson Victoria would have no choice but to learn. The day passed with a quiet normalcy that felt almost surreal. I went through my usual routine, answering emails from my consulting firm, reviewing reports, and coordinating projects, all while carrying the knowledge of what I had set in motion. Sarah joined me for lunch, her presence calm and unassuming, as if nothing had changed. She didn't need to comment on my actions. She understood. Victoria, completely unaware of the revocation, continued planning the wedding. I caught glimpses of her posts on social media, the excitement in her voice when she spoke to friends about table arrangements, floral selections, and the final touches on the menu. She described the photographers arriving from Milan, the cake tasting she'd scheduled, the last fittings for her gown. Every detail she reveled in was built upon the funds I had quietly withdrawn. I felt a strange mix of anticipation and detachment. The tension was entirely one-sided for now. She was oblivious to the reality creeping toward her, focused entirely on the fantasy she believed was fully funded and secured. I sipped my coffee slowly, watching the city hum outside my apartment window, and allowed myself to feel the weight of the calm, knowing the storm was coming. Each notification from my bank confirming the revocation lingered in my mind, a quiet pulse of inevitability. The vendors would soon discover the missing payments, and Victoria would have to confront the consequences of planning a wedding she could not fully finance. The lesson she had avoided for years was approaching, and I would witness it unfold with measured patience. As the afternoon sun shifted across the skyline, I set my notes aside and stretched, feeling the resolve in my chest solidify. Sarah poured another cup of coffee and offered a soft smile, and I returned it, acknowledging the quiet reassurance she provided. For now, the city continued unaware of the disruption ahead, and I continued my day, ready to watch the first ripple of consequence reach Victoria. Tomorrow would bring the first signs of that ripple, and with it, the beginning of her reckoning. By mid-morning, the first signs of trouble reached Victoria. The florist called, her voice polite but tinged with confusion. "Mrs. Hayes, we haven't received the remaining payment for the chateau flowers. The deposit was applied, but the balance is showing as unpaid." Victoria froze, her fingers hovering over the phone. She tried to reassure herself, thinking it must be a mistake, that somehow the transfer had been delayed. But as the calls started coming in one after another, the caterer, the photographer, even the linen and decor suppliers, the reality sank in. Nothing had gone through. Nothing would. Her messages escalated in desperation. Emails marked urgent, texts pleading for solutions, and finally a voicemail in which her voice cracked under pressure. She had never had to solve a problem like this on her own. Every vendor she had counted on now required immediate action, and she had no access to the funds she believed were guaranteed. From my quiet vantage point, I watched the pattern unfold without interference. The lesson I had orchestrated was unfolding exactly as it should. Every frantic call and worried email highlighted not malice or misfortune, but the simple truth Victoria had never truly been responsible for her own planning, never been required to face the consequences of relying too heavily on others. The independence she had assumed came with limits, and those limits were now unavoidable. I reflected on the years she had spent immersed in her own ambitions, her life carefully scaffolded by the resources I had provided. This was not cruelty. This was accountability, delayed but necessary. The panic in her messages revealed both her shock and her inexperience. She had assumed her world would remain insulated from the realities of her actions. Now she understood that trust and entitlement are not the same thing. Hours passed, and the tension in her communications escalated. Her tone shifted from disbelief to desperation, from confusion to self-recrimination, as the consequences of her assumptions became undeniable. For the first time, the safety net she had taken for granted had disappeared, and she had to face the gap alone. By the end of the day, the chaos had reached every corner of her planning. Each vendor call, each missed transfer, was a reminder of the independence she had never cultivated and the responsibility she had ignored. She had never experienced this level of pressure, and the reality of her situation was inescapable. And as evening approached, I knew that the next confrontation, when she finally reached out to me directly, would mark the true turning point in this lesson. The phone rang just as I was finishing dinner with Sarah. The caller ID read Victoria Hayes. I took a deep breath before answering, my voice steady. "Hello? Victoria? Mom? Dad? Eleanor. We have a huge problem," she said, her voice tight and wavering. "The vendors, none of the payments went through. They're threatening to cancel everything. What's happening?" "You guaranteed these funds, I understand," I said calmly. "And I also understand that you planned this wedding, assuming you wouldn't have to manage the consequences yourself." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "What do you mean?" "Of course, I can handle this. I just need you to fix it." I let her words hang for a moment. "Victoria, I did not remove the funds out of anger or spite. I removed them because you were unprepared to be accountable. This is a lesson in responsibility, something you have avoided for years by relying on others to carry the weight of your choices." She was silent for a beat, then began to argue, her tone desperate and rising. "This isn't fair. You promised to pay. It's my wedding. And you said you'd support me. I can't cancel the florist, the catering, the chateau." "You were supported, yes," I replied, "but not at the cost of respect or your understanding of responsibility. You planned this event expecting financial safety without oversight or consequence. That expectation has ended. You need to learn the difference between entitlement and accountability." Her voice cracked. "But I need this. Everyone is counting on me. I can't lose everything. Then this is the moment you face the reality of your choices, I said firmly. I will not interfere to shield you from the consequences you have avoided. You are capable. Victoria, you have simply never had to act under pressure before. There was a pause, and I could hear her breathing, uneven and heavy. I knew the gravity of what she was realizing. The independence she had taken for granted was not automatic, and the support she assumed unconditional was conditional on respect and responsibility. I understand, she whispered finally, though it sounded more like acknowledgement than acceptance. I let the line go quiet for a moment before speaking. It is time for you to take control of what is yours, with the understanding that actions have consequences. As I hung up, the calm clarity that had guided my decision settled over me. Tomorrow would bring the final echoes of this lesson, and Victoria would confront fully the reality she had ignored until now. The following days brought confirmation of what I had already anticipated. Calls from vendors confirmed that bookings were canceled, contracts voided, and services halted. Victoria's wedding, which she had envisioned with such meticulous care, unraveled in ways she could not immediately control. Her panic-filled messages continued, but now there was no longer any recourse. She had relied too heavily on a financial safety net that was no longer there, and the consequences were absolute. I sat in my study, letting the reality of her collapse settle around me. This was not satisfaction or revenge. It was the quiet clarity of a lesson long overdue. 12 years of parenting had been filled with love and support, but also with moments where I had failed to enforce boundaries. My late husband, Michael, had always believed that respect and responsibility were inseparable, that generosity without accountability could breed entitlement. His absence had left me to navigate these lessons alone. But now, in this moment, I could honor both his memory and the values we had tried to instill in Victoria. I reflected on the choices I had made, letting her live with privileges I had earned, funding her ambitions, ensuring her success, but never at the cost of her learning independence or accountability. By withdrawing the remaining funds, I had not destroyed her life. I had created the conditions for her to understand the weight of her decisions. Sarah came by in the evening, and we spoke quietly about the events, not with gloating, but with measured perspective. She reminded me that boundaries are acts of love, that sometimes protecting someone from themselves does more harm than allowing them to experience consequence. I felt the truth in that, and the quiet strength in knowing I had acted according to principle rather than impulse. Victoria's messages softened in tone over the next few weeks, tinged with acknowledgement and reluctant reflection. There was the faintest suggestion that reconciliation might be possible someday, but only if it was built on respect and mutual accountability. I had done what I could to teach her a lesson, and the rest was in her hands. I closed the folder with the wedding documents, letting the finality settle in. Love, I realized, does not mean enabling, and respect is never negotiable, even from those we cherish most. The clarity of that understanding stayed with me, as steady and unyielding as the life I had built, guiding the next chapter of both my own life and, perhaps someday, hers.